If you were a native child in North America during the late 19th or early 20th century, the sound that might haunt you for the rest of your life would not be the drums of your ancestors or the songs of your people. It would be the whistle of a train. Because when that whistle blew, it often meant that government officials or missionaries had come to your community, and they weren't there to talk or to listen. They were there to take you away. The policy was called assimilation. The idea, on paper, was that Indigenous children could be civilized, molded into the image of white society. But behind the words, behind the polished speeches and the official reports, lay a system of cruelty designed to erase entire cultures. The slogan of Captain Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, summed it up with chilling clarity. Kill the Indian, save the man. To those who built and ran these schools, native culture was something to be destroyed. Language, traditions, clothing, spiritual practices, all were seen as obstacles to progress. To them, the child was raw material that had to be stripped of identity, reshaped into a replica of their conquerors. And so, beginning in the 1870s, native children were taken some forcibly, others through coercion from their homes, and placed in boarding schools far from everything they knew. The journey began with separation. Children as young as 5 or 6 were torn from the arms of their parents, often with no warning, sometimes with threats of jail for families who resisted. In some cases, military force was used to round up children. Mothers wailed, fathers stood powerless, communities fractured as their youngest members were carried away. For many, it was the last time they ever saw their families. Upon arrival at the schools, the process of transformation began immediately. Traditional clothing was stripped off and burned. Long hair, which carried deep cultural and spiritual meaning in many native nations, was cut short. For boys, it was often shaved close to the scalp. For girls, braids were hacked off, sometimes crudely, with scissors or even knives. The children cried, not only from humiliation, but from the spiritual violence being done to them. In many indigenous cultures, hair was sacred. Cutting it was an act of mourning, a sign of loss. At the boarding schools, it was a ritual of forced rebirth, a rebirth into an identity the children never asked for. Next came the language. The moment a child spoke in their native tongue, punishment followed. Sometimes it was soap shoved into the mouth. Other times it was beatings, extra chores, or solitary confinement. At Carlisle, children caught speaking their language were forced to wear signs reading, "I am dumb," around their necks. The message was clear. Your words, your songs, your voice, none of them belong here. You must abandon them or suffer. Religious conversion was mandatory. Children were baptized, made to attend Christian services, and taught that their ancestral beliefs were savage or demonic. Traditional ceremonies were outlawed. Drumming, chanting, and sacred dances were forbidden. A child who prayed in the old ways could expect harsh retribution. Teachers drilled into them the belief that salvation required rejecting their families and communities. For many, this spiritual assault was as devastating as the physical punishments. The daily routine was rigid, militaristic. Children rose at dawn, lined up for inspection, and marched to meals and classes. Discipline was enforced with strict punishments. Some schools operated more like prisons than classrooms. Students drilled with military precision, wearing uniforms, learning obedience before they ever touched a book. Education was minimal, designed not to inspire, but to domesticate. Boys were taught manual labor, farming, and trades, while girls were trained in housekeeping, sewing, and laundry. The message was clear. You were not being educated to thrive. You were being trained to serve. Hunger was constant. Food was often meager, spoiled, or insufficient. Children ate thin soups, stale bread, sometimes rancid meat. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, leaving them vulnerable to disease. Tuberculosis, measles, influenza, all tore through the crowded dormitories. Medical care was poor or non-existent. Thousands of children died, their bodies buried in unmarked graves near the schools, their names forgotten, their families never notified. And beyond hunger and illness, there was abuse. Survivors' testimonies describe beatings with belts, whips, and sticks. They speak of children locked in closets, forced to kneel on hard floors for hours, or paraded in front of their peers for public humiliation. Others recall even darker memories: sexual abuse by staff, exploitation of vulnerable children whose voices were silenced by fear. The trauma was not isolated. It was systemic, woven into the fabric of these institutions. Yet perhaps the cruelest weapon was loneliness. Letters from home were censored, sometimes withheld entirely. Visits were rare, sometimes forbidden. Brothers and sisters were often separated upon arrival, placed in different dormitories, denied the comfort of even speaking to one another. Imagine being 6 years old, unable to speak your language, forbidden to comfort your sibling, punished for remembering who you were. Imagine crying in the dark, surrounded by strangers, with no one to hold you. This was the reality for generations of Native children. Still, survival meant adaptation. Some children learned to play the system, speaking English in public while whispering their language in secret. They hid cultural practices, smuggled traditions into songs or stories disguised as games. Some found solace in friendships, forming bonds with other children that became lifelines. Others clung to fragments of memory, repeating family names, tribal stories, prayers, or songs in their heads so they would not be lost. But many did not survive at all. Estimates suggest that thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of Native children died in these schools across the United States and Canada. At Carlisle alone, nearly 200 are buried in the school cemetery, their names etched into stone markers that tell nothing of their lives. Across the continent, investigations today continue to uncover unmarked graves at former school sites, grim testimony to the scale of loss. The children who did return home were changed forever. Some had forgotten their languages, unable to speak to their grandparents. Others carried deep shame, taught to despise their heritage. Families struggled to reconnect, torn between love and the walls of trauma built by years of separation. Generations later, the scars remain. Addiction, suicide, fractured families all trace roots back to the boarding school era. It was not just individuals who were broken, but entire nations. And yet, amidst the suffering, resilience endured. Many survivors, despite the abuse, found ways to carry their traditions forward. Some reclaimed their languages in adulthood, teaching them to new generations. Others became activists, demanding acknowledgement, apology, and justice. Their voices tell us not only of what was lost, but of what survived, what refused to be destroyed. Because the truth about Native American boarding schools is not just a story of pain, it is also a story of resistance. Every child who whispered their language in secret, every elder who passed down stories despite the threat of punishment, every family who held fast to tradition, even when the government tried to erase it, these were acts of defiance. Acts that kept cultures alive through a century of attempted eradication. But for you, had you been a child in that time, survival would have been uncertain. Could you endure the hunger, the beatings, the endless pressure to forget who you were? Could you live day after day knowing your family might never see you again? Could you keep alive the memory of your people when every force around you demanded silence? For thousands, the answer was no. For others, survival came at the cost of scars, carried for life. This was the reality of Native American boarding schools. Institutions built not to nurture but to erase, not to teach, but to control. Their disturbing truth is written not only in history books, but in the lives of survivors, in the grief of families, and in the resilience of cultures that, against all odds, still endure. By the dawn of the 20th century, Native American boarding schools were no longer an experiment. They were an entrenched system. The United States and Canada had committed fully to the policy of forced assimilation, pouring money into the construction and operation of schools designed to absorb entire generations of Indigenous youth. What began in the 1870s as scattered institutions grew into a sprawling network. In the U.S., over 350 boarding schools operated at one time or another, and in Canada, the residential school system became central to national Indian policy. The justification remained the same. Officials claimed they were offering education and opportunity, a path out of so-called savagery into modern society. But the truth was plain in the daily lives of the children. They were not being prepared to thrive, but to vanish as Indigenous people. Reports from the era revealed the system's intent with blunt honesty. One government official described the goal as absorbing the Indian into the great body of our citizenry until the race shall become extinct. Another declared, "It is cheaper to educate Indians than to kill them." The language may have softened over time, but the mission was as ruthless as ever: cultural genocide under the guise of education. For children, the system meant a life of confinement. The schools were often hundreds of miles from their communities, making visits from family impossible. The government preferred it this way. Distance meant severed ties. Children were given new names, English names, and their identities were rewritten in school ledgers. Old names were dismissed as unpronounceable, unworthy of record. Some never heard their real names again, condemned to be called by words that meant nothing to them. At the core of the schools was labor. Students spent long hours working in fields, kitchens, and workshops, often doing the work needed to keep the schools running. This was not framed as exploitation, but as industrial training. For boys, it meant farming, carpentry, blacksmithing, or manual labor. For girls, it meant endless laundry, sewing, and domestic service. The intention was clear. Native children would not be taught to become leaders, thinkers, or creators. They would be taught to serve. The academic curriculum was shallow, designed to reinforce submission. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught, but only to a basic level, enough to function as workers in a white world. History lessons praised European explorers, colonizers, and presidents, while native histories were erased or recast as tales of savagery overcome by civilization. Geography maps highlighted European cities and American growth, but ignored tribal territories and cultural landmarks. Children were taught not to see their people as part of history, but as relics of a past best forgotten. Punishment remained central to control. A child caught speaking their language or practicing their traditions faced humiliation and pain. Survivors tell stories of being forced to stand for hours with arms outstretched until muscles burned, of being beaten with canes, of being locked in dark closets. Some recall being made to kneel on broom bristles or to scrub floors with lye until their hands bled. One survivor remembered being whipped until her back was raw, simply because she had spoken to a friend in her native tongue. The violence was not random, it was deliberate, a strategy to instill fear and obedience. But perhaps more damaging than the physical punishments were the lessons of shame. Children were told their languages were primitive, their families backward, their gods false. Teachers mocked traditional clothing and food, ridiculing anything that tied the children to their people. They were told to feel ashamed of who they were, ashamed of their parents, ashamed of their culture. Over time, some internalized these messages, learning to despise the very things that once gave them pride. Others resisted inwardly, clinging silently to their heritage. But the burden of carrying this shame into adulthood would haunt generations. Disease continued to claim countless lives. Overcrowded dormitories became breeding grounds for tuberculosis, measles, and influenza. Poor nutrition left immune systems weak, and medical neglect sealed the fate of many. At some schools, death rates were staggering. Reports showed mortality rates as high as 30% in certain institutions. For every child who returned home, Many others never did. Parents waited in anguish, often receiving no word of their child's death until years later, if at all. Many were buried in school cemeteries, their graves unmarked or marked only by wooden crosses that have long since rotted away. The system also created deep fractures within Native communities. Returning students often found themselves estranged from their families. After years of being punished for speaking their language, many could no longer communicate with parents and grandparents. Some felt ashamed of their families, uncivilized ways, a shame drilled into them by teachers and missionaries. Others carried resentment, anger that their parents had allowed them to be taken, not realizing their parents had often been coerced or threatened. Families were left divided, bonds strained or broken by forces beyond their control. Even among survivors, the trauma manifested in silence. Many who endured the schools refused to speak of them later in life, burying their pain rather than reliving it. Others turned to alcohol or other means to dull the memories. Some passed the trauma on, not by choice, but because the patterns of abuse and loss carried forward into the next generation. This is what scholars mean by intergenerational trauma. The wounds inflicted on one generation echoing through the lives of their children and grandchildren. Still, not every child was broken. Some found small acts of resistance, ways to preserve their identity in secret. Survivors recall whispering their languages to one another in the dark, teaching songs and prayers in hushed voices so the knowledge would not die. Some wrote letters home in their own tongue, hoping their families would understand even if the teachers could not. A few found allies among sympathetic staff members, though such kindnesses were rare. These acts may seem small, but in the face of overwhelming attempts at erasure, they were powerful. They kept alive the possibility of cultural survival. The psychological impact of the boarding school system cannot be overstated. Imagine being a child told every day that who you are is wrong, that your family is wrong, that your very existence is a mistake to be corrected. Imagine being punished for dreaming in your own language, for remembering your traditions. Over time, such messages erode the sense of self, leaving scars that last a lifetime. Many survivors struggled with identity, caught between two worlds, alienated from white society that never fully accepted them, and from their own communities where they felt estranged after years away. This sense of dislocation became a hallmark of the boarding school experience. Government officials continued to promote the system well into the 20th century. In the U.S., the Merriam Report of 1928 finally acknowledged the widespread failures and abuses of the boarding schools, describing poor conditions, inadequate food, and high death rates. But even this damning report did not bring the system to an immediate end. Schools continued to operate for decades, with some lasting into the 1970s and beyond. In Canada, residential schools remained active until the late 1990s, with the last one closing in 1996. The persistence of these schools speaks to the depth of the ideology behind them. The goal of assimilation was not a temporary policy, but a foundational belief of the governments that created them. To them, indigenous cultures were obstacles to national unity, problems to be solved, threats to be erased. And so, even in the face of reports, protests, and visible suffering, the schools endured generation after generation. For you, had you been placed in such a school in the early 20th century, survival would have meant more than enduring hunger or avoiding punishment. It would have meant navigating the constant psychological warfare of being told that you, your family, and your people were less than human. Could you withstand years of such messages without breaking? Could you hold on to your identity when every authority figure demanded you let it go? For many, the answer was no. For those who did endure, survival often came at a terrible cost. By mid-century, cracks began to show in the system. Indigenous activists and communities grew increasingly vocal, challenging the abuses and demanding change. Some survivors began to share their stories, breaking the silence that had shielded the schools for so long. Yet the struggle for recognition was slow, and governments were reluctant to admit the full scope of harm. It would take decades more for the truth to emerge. And that truth, as we will see, was darker than many could imagine. The 20th century did not soften the boarding school system, it extended it. Abuse, neglect, and cultural destruction continued, hidden from the wider public until survivors forced the world to listen. By the second half of the 20th century, the machinery of assimilation had begun to change form, but the underlying goal remained the same. The old brick and stone boarding schools, many built in the late 1800s, were deteriorating, but the philosophy of removing Native children from their families continued through foster care programs and day schools run under the same principles. Some children were still forced into distant institutions, while others were absorbed into systems designed to sever them from their roots in quieter, less visible ways. For the children still inside the boarding schools, conditions remained harsh. Survivors from the 1950s and 1960s describe hunger, relentless labor, and punishments just as severe as those endured by their parents and grandparents. The beatings for speaking native languages continued. The forced labor continued. The endless lessons in shame continued. Generations of children, each taught to suppress their identity, carried wounds into adulthood that could not be seen, but were deeply felt. By the 1970s, the cracks in the system could no longer be ignored. In the United States, the American Indian Movement, AIM, began drawing attention to abuses in boarding schools, alongside broader injustices faced by Native communities. Activists occupied BIA offices, held demonstrations, and demanded investigations. Their voices broke into mainstream awareness, forcing the public to confront what had long been ignored. Yet even as Native communities fought for change, the system found new ways to perpetuate itself. Foster care programs expanded dramatically, with Native children disproportionately taken from their families under claims of neglect or unfitness. These removals often had more to do with poverty than with genuine danger, but they followed the same logic that had guided the boarding schools. Native families were seen as inferior, incapable of raising children by white standards. By the mid-1970s, it was estimated that between 25 and 35% of all Native children in the U.S. had been removed from their homes and placed into non-Native families or institutions. This crisis sparked the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978, which sought to keep Native children with Native families whenever possible. But the damage had already been done. Another generation had been lost to cultural severance, their identities fractured by the same forces that had haunted their parents and grandparents. In Canada, the system lingered even longer. Residential schools continued operating into the 1980s and 1990s, with the last school closing only in 1996. For many Canadians, the idea that such institutions still existed at the end of the 20th century came as a shock. But for Indigenous families, it was their lived reality. Entire communities bore the weight of these schools across 3, 4, even 5 generations. It was not until survivors began to speak publicly about their experiences that the full truth started to emerge. At first, many spoke in whispers, sharing with family members or in community gatherings. But as they realized how many shared their pain, the silence began to break. Testimonies surfaced describing not only the expected abuses, beatings, starvation, neglect, but also darker horrors. Stories of sexual abuse by priests and teachers, stories of children disappearing without explanation, stories of unmarked graves hidden on school grounds. At first, these stories were dismissed by officials as exaggerations or isolated incidents. But the sheer volume of testimony became impossible to ignore. Survivors who had never met one another described the same patterns, the same abuses, the same unacknowledged losses. The truth was undeniable. In 2008, Canada issued a formal apology for the residential school system. Prime Minister Stephen Harper acknowledged that the policy of assimilation was wrong, that it had caused lasting harm, and that it represented a dark chapter in the nation's history. The apology was followed by the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which gathered thousands of testimonies from survivors. For 6 years, the commission traveled across Canada, listening to the voices of those who had endured the schools. Their stories formed a record of suffering and resilience, a collective memory that could no longer be denied. The commission's final report was devastating. It concluded that the residential school system amounted to cultural genocide. The evidence was overwhelming. Generations of children taken, families destroyed, languages suppressed, traditions attacked, and entire communities scarred. The commission called for sweeping changes, from education reform to the recognition of Indigenous rights, but perhaps its greatest achievement was simply making the truth public. No longer could anyone claim ignorance. In the United States, acknowledgement came more slowly. In 2009, Congress quietly passed a resolution apologizing for the government's role in the boarding school system. But unlike Canada's public apology, this one was buried in the text of a defense appropriations bill and never read aloud. Many Indigenous leaders saw this as an empty gesture, a way of avoiding true accountability. Only in recent years has the U.S. begun to confront the full scope of its boarding school history, with investigations launched to uncover the realities that survivors have long described. Then, in 2021, the world's attention turned sharply to the ground beneath these schools. In May of that year, the Tk'emlúps te Secwepemc First Nation in British Columbia announced the discovery of 215 unmarked graves at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. The news sent shockwaves across Canada and beyond. It was confirmation of what survivors had said all along, that many children had died at the schools, and their deaths had been hidden. Soon, other discoveries followed. Hundreds of graves at Maryeville in Saskatchewan, dozens more at Kootenay. Investigations spread, revealing the truth buried in the earth, that thousands of children had never come home. In the United States, similar efforts began, with searches conducted at sites like Carlisle and dozens of other boarding schools. The findings continue to grow, each grave a reminder of lives stolen and families left in grief. The revelations reignited demands for justice. Vigils were held across North America. Shoes and stuffed animals were placed on the steps of churches and government buildings to honor the children. Survivors who had carried their stories for decades found themselves both vindicated and re-traumatized, forced to relive the pain of memories long suppressed. Communities grieved not only for the children who were lost, but also for the generations that had lived in silence, carrying wounds that no one had acknowledged. The impact of the boarding school system cannot be measured only in numbers or policies. It lives in the fractured identities of survivors, in the struggles of their descendants to reclaim languages nearly lost, in the cycles of trauma that persist to this day. Addiction, poverty, suicide, all are tied, in part, to the legacy of these institutions. But alongside this pain, there is resilience. Today, Indigenous communities across North America are working to revive what was nearly destroyed. Language revitalization programs bring ancestral tongues back into classrooms and homes. Ceremonies once banned are practiced openly again, reconnecting people to traditions their grandparents were forbidden to know. Survivors speak to younger generations, not to spread pain, but to ensure the truth is known and never forgotten. The struggle for justice continues. Calls for reparations grow louder. Churches that ran many of the schools face lawsuits and demands for accountability. Governments are pressed to do more than apologize, to return land, to support healing programs, to recognize Indigenous sovereignty. The boarding school story is no longer hidden, but its consequences are far from resolved. And for you, listening now, the question is simple. Could you have survived it? Could you have endured the separation, the abuse, The erasure of identity? Could you have lived in a place designed to make you forget who you were? To make you hate where you came from? Many did not survive. Many who did were never the same again. The disturbing truth about Native American boarding schools is not just history, it is living memory. The last survivors are still with us. Their story is a reminder that the past is not past. It lingers in families, in communities, in the very land where unmarked graves still wait to be uncovered. The story is not finished because the process of truth and reconciliation is only beginning. When we ask why these schools existed, the answer is painful but clear. They were created to erase a people, and they nearly succeeded. But when we ask what remains today, the answer is something the architects of assimilation never anticipated: survival. Against all odds, indigenous peoples have held on. Their languages, their traditions, their cultures endure, carried forward by those who refuse to let them die. And perhaps that is the most important truth of all. The schools sought to extinguish indigenous identity, but they failed. Every story told by a survivor, every word spoken in a reclaimed language, every ceremony revived, is a victory over the system that tried to erase them. The disturbing truth is not only about what was lost, it is about what endures. And it is up to us to listen, to remember, and to ensure that such a system can never rise again.